The night was colder than usual, a soft mist rolling in over the quiet streets of Maplewood. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. Most of the town had already settled in for the night, windows glowing with the warmth of families inside. But for one little girl, the darkness held something unexpected, something that would change her life forever. Lena, just 7 years old, was never the type to wander far from home. She was a careful child, always listening to her mother's warnings about staying close, especially after dark. But that evening, something had drawn her outside. Maybe it was the way the wind whispered through the trees, or the distant sound of crickets singing their nighttime tune. Or maybe, deep down, she had felt something that told her she wasn't alone. As she stepped cautiously onto the sidewalk, the world around her seemed to stretch wider, the familiar houses towering like silent giants. The street, usually filled with laughter and passing cars during the day, was eerily still. Lena shivered and hugged herself, ready to turn back. And that's when she saw him, a stray dog. At first, she wasn't scared. He wasn't large or threatening, just a scruffy, thin creature with patches of fur missing, his ribs faintly visible beneath his dull coat. His eyes, though, those eyes were different. They weren't wild like the other stray dogs she had seen before. They held something deeper, something she couldn't quite understand. It was almost as if he knew her. The dog took a step forward, head slightly lowered, but his tail wagged just enough to show he meant no harm. Lena hesitated. Her mother had always told her to be careful around stray animals, but something about this one made her pause. He wasn't begging for food. He wasn't barking or growling. He was just there, watching her. And then, in a split second, everything changed. A sudden rustling from the alley nearby. A noise that didn't belong. Lena turned her head sharply. She hadn't noticed it before, but now she saw a figure, a shadow lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlight. Her heartbeat quickened. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe it was nothing at all. But before she could even take a breath, the dog moved. He growled, low and deep, his body tense, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. His eyes locked onto the darkness ahead, his entire stance shifting from calm to protective. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if he had known all along. Lena's small hands clenched into fists. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but her legs wouldn't move. And then the dog lunged. What happened next would leave everyone in the town speechless. The police, her parents, even Lena herself, because no one, absolutely no one, could believe what the stray dog had just done. But the truth? The truth was even stranger than anyone could have imagined. Lena barely had time to react before the dog launched himself forward, a blur of fur and instinct. A deep, guttural snarl ripped through the quiet night, cutting through the eerie silence like a knife. The figure in the shadows moved, too fast, too sudden. Lena felt her breath hitch as she stumbled back, her small hands gripping the fabric of her sweater, heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. The dog didn't hesitate. His body was tense, muscles coiled like a wire stretched too tight. He barked, a sharp, warning sound that echoed down the empty street. Lena saw the shadow shift again, a quick, jerky movement like someone deciding whether to run or fight. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the figure turned and bolted. Lena felt her knees weaken as she watched the shadow disappear down the alley, swallowed by the darkness. The dog, however, didn't chase. He stood firm, his head low, his ears pinned back as he growled into the emptiness. He stayed like that for several seconds, unmoving, making sure the danger had passed. Then, slowly, he turned back to Lena. Her legs were shaking. She wanted to run home, to call for her mother, to pretend none of this had happened. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Her wide eyes met the dog's, and for the first time, she truly saw him. Not just as a stray, not just as an animal, but as something more. He had protected her. She swallowed hard, unsure of what to say or do. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The dog blinked, his tail giving the smallest wag, but there was something else in his expression, something that almost felt like understanding. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the street, and Lena knew she couldn't stay out here any longer. She turned, taking a hesitant step toward her house, expecting the dog to leave now that the danger was gone. But when she glanced over her shoulder, he was still there, following a few steps behind her. She didn't stop him. When she finally reached her front yard, the porch light casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk, she turned again. Are you hungry?" she asked softly. She wasn't even sure if he would stay long enough to eat, but something inside her needed to offer. The dog didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just sat, patiently waiting. Lena slowly pushed open the front door and stepped inside, her heart still beating too fast. The house was quiet. Her mother must have already gone to bed, trusting that Lena was tucked safely in her room. She tiptoed to the kitchen, opening the fridge as quietly as possible. She grabbed a slice of leftover chicken, her small fingers wrapping around the cold meat. When she crept back outside, the dog was still there, sitting exactly where she had left him. She held out the food. "Here." He hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, gently taking it from her hand. His nose brushed against her fingers, warm and soft, and Lena couldn't help but smile just a little. She sat down on the porch, wrapping her arms around her knees as she watched him eat. "You're not like other dogs," she murmured. "Are you?" The dog lifted his head, licking his muzzle. His gaze never left hers. Lena let out a breath, her mind still spinning from what had happened. Who had been in that alley? Why had they been watching her? And how had this dog, this stray, this nobody, known to protect her? She wanted to tell her mother. She wanted to wake her up and explain everything. But deep down, she already knew what would happen. No one would believe her. A stray dog saving a little girl from danger? It sounded like something out of a bedtime story, not real life. Her mother would probably just tell her she imagined it, that it was just a coincidence. Maybe she would even scold her for sneaking outside at night. Lena pulled her sweater tighter around herself, a chill creeping into her bones. She looked down at the dog again. He had finished eating, but he hadn't left. Instead, he had curled up near her feet, his tail wrapping around his body as if he planned to stay. She didn't know why, but somehow that made her feel safe. That night, Lena slept more soundly than she had in a long time. The next morning, she expected the dog to be gone. Maybe he would have wandered off, moving on to the next place, the next meal. But when she stepped outside, he was still there, sitting in the same spot as if he had been waiting for her. She grinned. "I guess you're my dog now." The dog tilted his head, his ears perking up slightly, and for the first time, Lena laughed. What she didn't know was that this was only the beginning, because whatever had been lurking in the shadows that night, it wasn't gone. Lena named him Max. It felt right, even though she didn't know why. Maybe because he seemed strong, like a protector, or maybe just because he reminded her of something constant, something that wouldn't leave, even when everything else felt uncertain. For the next few days, Max stayed close. He never barked without reason, never begged for food, never wandered too far. It was as if he had made a decision, one he had no plans to change. Lena liked having him around. She felt safer with him near. But there was something else, something she couldn't shake. The feeling that someone was watching her. It wasn't all the time, but certain moments made her skin prickle. Like when she walked home from school and caught a glimpse of a figure just out of sight, disappearing around a corner too quickly. Or when she played outside with Max, and the air suddenly felt heavy, like unseen eyes were lingering nearby. It was subtle, nothing she could explain, but she knew it wasn't just in her head. One afternoon, she told her best friend, Emma, about it. They sat on the swings in Emma's backyard, pushing themselves gently back and forth as the autumn leaves swirled around them. "Maybe it's just your imagination," Emma said, kicking at the dirt. "You do read a lot of mystery books." Lena shook her head. "It's not my imagination. I know when I'm being watched." Emma wrinkled her nose. "By who?" Lena hesitated. That was the problem. She didn't know. It wasn't like she could point and say, "That person right there." It was just a presence, a shadow that disappeared before she could get a clear look. Max, who had been lying beside the swing set, lifted his head suddenly. His ears perked up and his body tensed. Lena noticed immediately. Emma followed her gaze. "What's wrong with him?" Lena didn't answer. She turned her head slowly, scanning the yard. Nothing. Just trees swaying in the breeze, the quiet hum of cars passing in the distance. But Max didn't relax. His eyes remained fixed beyond the fence, his muscles stiff. Then in a flash, he was on his feet. A deep, warning growl rumbled from his throat. Lena's stomach tightened. She didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but she knew better than to ignore Max. Emma jumped off the swing. "Okay, now you're freaking me out." Max took a few steps toward the fence, his tail rigid. He wasn't barking. He was listening, sensing. Then, just as quickly as it started, he backed away, his growl fading. He turned to Lena, his ears twitching as if waiting for her to understand. Emma exhaled. That was weird. Lena didn't say anything, but inside, a knot of fear tightened. That night, she kept her window slightly open, just enough to hear if anything was out there. Max curled up on the porch below, his body resting, but his ears always alert. She wanted to believe Emma was right, that maybe she was imagining things. But Max wasn't, and that meant something was out there. The next morning, Lena walked to school like usual, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. Max tried to follow, but she told him to stay. He whined but obeyed, watching her go with those deep, knowing eyes. As she turned onto the main road, she felt it again, that weight, that unseen presence pressing against her. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to keep walking. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A man. He was standing across the street, half hidden by a bus stop, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. He wasn't doing anything, not talking, not moving, just standing there, watching. Lena's breath hitched. She quickened her steps, her heart hammering. Maybe he was just waiting for the bus. Maybe he wasn't looking at her at all. But then he took a step forward. Lena's pulse spiked. She didn't wait to find out more. She broke into a run, her shoes slapping against the pavement, her breath coming fast. The school was just ahead. She could make it. She didn't dare look back. When she finally burst through the school doors, her chest heaving, she forced herself to calm down. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was overreacting. But deep down she knew. She had seen his face just before she ran. And she had seen him before. Not at school. Not in town. She had seen him in the alley that night. The night Max saved her. He had been there. And now he was back. Lena couldn't focus for the rest of the school day. Her hands felt clammy. Her heart beat too fast. And every time someone walked past the classroom window, she flinched. She kept replaying the moment in her head. The way the man had stood there, still, watching. The way he had moved toward her just as she ran. It wasn't a coincidence. She knew it wasn't. By the time the final bell rang, her stomach was in knots. Normally, she would have walked home with Emma, but today, she just wanted to get back to Max as quickly as possible. He would know if something was wrong. He always did. She stepped outside, scanning the street before moving. Everything looked normal. Kids laughing, parents waiting in cars, the sun casting warm afternoon light over the sidewalk. But she didn't let herself relax. She took the long way home, cutting through the park instead of walking along the main road. It was quieter here, the trees rustling softly, the faint sound of a basketball bouncing on a far-off court. She kept her head down, walking quickly. Then, the feeling returned. That same heavy weight, the pressure of unseen eyes. She swallowed hard and forced herself to look up. A man sat on a bench near the playground, a newspaper held in front of his face. But Lena could see the truth. His eyes weren't on the paper. They were on her. She didn't hesitate. She turned sharply and broke into a run. Her feet pounded against the pavement, her breath coming fast. She didn't know if he was following her, but she wasn't going to slow down to find out. She sprinted across the street, nearly tripping over the curb as she rounded the corner toward home. Her house was in sight now, and there, waiting on the porch, was Max. He saw her before she even called out. In an instant, he was on his feet, his ears pinned back, his body tense. She had never seen him like this before. Lena ran straight to him, barely able to catch her breath. "Max," she gasped, her hands gripping his fur. "Someone's following me." Max didn't move at first. His whole body was still, locked onto something in the distance. Then he growled, low and deep, more dangerous than before. Lena turned, following his gaze. The man had stopped at the end of the street. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't pretending to be just another person walking by. He stood there, staring directly at her. And then, slowly, he took a step forward. Max lunged. Lena barely had time to react as Max tore across the yard, his growl turning into a fierce, unrelenting bark. She had never seen him like this. Pure instinct, pure protection. The man hesitated for just a moment, then turned and ran. But Max didn't stop. He chased him down the street, disappearing around the corner. Lena wanted to scream, to call him back, but her voice caught in her throat. She stood frozen, heart racing, eyes locked on the empty space where they had both vanished. The street was silent now. Then, in the distance, an abrupt, sharp yelp. Lena's stomach dropped. Something was wrong. Lena didn't think. She just ran. Her feet barely touched the ground as she sprinted after Max, her pulse hammering in her ears. The sharp yelp still echoed in her mind, and fear twisted in her chest. She had never heard Max make a sound like that before. Not once. She turned the corner, her breath catching in her throat. The street ahead was empty. No sign of the man. No sign of Max. "Max," she called, her voice breaking. She spun around, searching, hoping, praying. Then, a rustling sound. Her head snapped toward an alley just a few feet away. It was narrow and dimly lit, squeezed between two old buildings. The air felt heavier here, colder, but she saw movement, a shadow shifting. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. And then, there he was. Max. He was standing near the back of the alley, his body low, his teeth bared. His fur bristled, and his deep growl rumbled through the air like distant thunder. But his front leg was lifted slightly, as if he had been hurt. Lena's stomach twisted. "Max," she whispered, taking a cautious step forward. That's when she saw him. The man. He was slumped against the brick wall, breathing hard. His hoodie was torn, and there was a deep scratch on his arm. Fresh red. His eyes flickered between Lena and Max, a mixture of anger and something else. Something almost like fear. Lena's hands clenched into fists. "Why are you following me?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The man didn't answer right away. His gaze locked on Max, watching the way the dog stood protectively in front of Lena, ready to pounce at any second. He swallowed hard. "That dog," he muttered, his voice rough. "He's not just some stray, is he?" Lena didn't know how to answer. The man let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Figures." He shifted against the wall, wincing. "I wasn't going to hurt you, kid." Lena stiffened. "Then why were you following me?" The man sighed, wiping his scratched arm with his sleeve. He hesitated, then finally muttered, "Because I know that dog." Lena's breath caught. "What?" The man exhaled. "That dog. Max, whatever you call him. He used to be mine." His voice had an edge of something Lena couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. Sadness. A long time ago. Lena looked down at Max, but his eyes never left the man. His growl hadn't stopped, his body still tense. The man ran a hand through his messy hair. "I lost him. Thought he was gone for good. And then one night I saw him. With you." His eyes met Lena's. I had to be sure." Lena felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, confusion, disbelief. "If he was yours, why didn't he go to you?" The man flinched just slightly. He rubbed his arm again, looking away. "Because he doesn't trust me anymore," he admitted. "And maybe he shouldn't." Lena swallowed. "What happened?" The man was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he said, "I wasn't a good person. I made mistakes. I let Max down. And he ran. I looked for him, but part of me knew he wouldn't come back." His jaw tightened. "So when I saw him with you, I thought, maybe he found someone better." Lena's chest tightened. She looked at Max again, her hand brushing against his fur. He didn't move. He was still watching, still waiting. The man sighed, pushing himself off the wall. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice softer now. "I just needed to see him one last time." Lena wasn't sure what to say. She didn't trust him. Not completely, but something about the way he spoke, the way his shoulders slumped, told her he wasn't lying. Max took a step closer to Lena, pressing against her side. The man nodded slightly. "Yeah," he murmured. "That's what I thought." He turned, stepping away from the wall. "Take care of him," he said over his shoulder. "He's special." Lena hesitated, then asked, "What's his real name?" The man paused, just for a moment. "Doesn't matter," he said finally. "Max suits him now." And with that, he walked away. Lena watched him disappear down the street, the weight of everything settling in her chest. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. But when she looked down at Max, she knew one thing for sure. No matter where he came from, no matter what his past was, he had chosen her. And she wasn't going to let him go. Max leaned in her side, his tail wagging just slightly. Lena smiled, ruffling his fur. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's go home." As they walked back, the sky turned golden, the sun dipping low on the horizon. The world felt a little different now, a little heavier, but Lena wasn't scared anymore. She had Max, and that was all that mattered.